Would you like to see some incredible upset wins from round 3 of the 2021 FIDE World Cup Game 1? I'm Grandmaster Max Illingworth, and in this video I'm going to share some really epic games where two 500 rated players and two 600 GMs completely smashed two 600 and even high two 700 Grandmasters, with the biggest upset actually being our first game that I'm going to share with you here. And that is a game where Shakhriyar Mamedyarov was playing as black, top 10 Grandmaster in the world, and you may recall he was on my top 10 players of all time list as well in a previous video. And in this game he was playing against the young Armenian talent Mamedyarov, where the game was a Grundfeld defense, but where Mamedyarov decided not to allow the Grundfeld with knight c3 and d5, which just so happens earlier today I went through the whole FIDE lifetime repertoire on the Grundfeld, so I have a quite good idea about the latest theory. And Mamedyarov decided he wanted to avoid the theoretical battle, so he played knight f3 and played the move g3, going for the fianchetto system instead. Mamedyarov didn't play it in the King's Indian or the Benoni spirit, but instead played the move c6, which is the very solid approach to the position after bishop g2, castles. And now d5, black has managed to stake his claim in the center. If white waits too long, maybe black can take and release the tension at some moment. White has a lot of different moves here, but with this being only a 2-game match, meaning that you only need to score 1.5 points to win the match, a lot of players with white will like to play very safely, play positions where only they can win, and it's basically going to be either a win or a draw. So Mamedyarov plays the move c takes d5, and then the move knight to c3, just getting this very symmetrical position where he'll make the argument that he can try to make something of his extra tempo. By the way, if you are enjoying my videos so far, do make sure to hit that like button, and if you are new to my channel, then click that red subscribe button for more enjoyable Grandmaster Chess videos. Let's continue with the game. I recall that Svidler actually recommends a move of knight to e4 in his course, if I remember it correctly. And the idea is that by pressuring the knight, you're also activating the bishop. White doesn't particularly want to take on e4, because then after d takes c4, there is some annoying pressure against the d4 pawn that does allow black to equalize with knight e5. There are many moves for black, but say queen d5 is one reasonable move to defend the pawn and to undermine the knight later, to build up that pressure against the pawn, as it were, that we see quite a lot in the Grundfeld that with the bishop on g7. It makes sense when you want to try and attack d4 with your pieces. And if white does play some other move like knight d2 or something, trying to get rid of the knight, well then black can always release the tension. For example, he can take on c3, or he can play f5 in a more stonewall fashion. There's more than one way for black to be okay here. But I think that knight e4 is the clearest equalizer. Granted, after knight c6, of course, white says, you know what, I'm going to borrow a page out of black's book, and I'm going to play the move knight e5, but where I've got that extra tempo with the knight move, which does give white some tiny chances for an advantage. Again, black doesn't really want to take e5 and create all that pressure against the d5 pawn. So Shak plays the move of bishop to f5 instead, just continuing to develop normally. But that does come at a small price, as we are going to see, where white now uses that extra tempo to play knight takes c6. And in terms of the pawn structure, we see that black is saddled with a backward c6 pawn along the half-open file, which can certainly become a little bit of a target later in the game. White played the move bishop f4, because in these structures what black would absolutely love is to be able to get a move like c5, or a break like e5 trying to hit back in the center. But neither of these moves are so easy to play, because if c5 we can simply take it, and if they do play knight d7 and insist on getting in e5, it's actually not all that great for black in the arising structure. After e5, d takes c5, knight takes c5. Black is still stuck with this backward pawn on c6. And if white just plays a solid move like b3, just allowing him to go queen d2 without getting harassed by some knight c4, well, white then is going to play a move like knight a4, getting some pressure against the pawn on c6, just to make some moves on the board after rook e8, queen d2, rook c8. Actually, maybe rook c8 isn't the best example move, but what I want to show is that when the knight does get to a4, it's going to have a very nice outpost on c5, fixing the c6 pawn as a potential weakness, and white is going to be a little bit better in such positions in principle. Okay, computer says that bishop g5 is actually better here, but okay, the general ideas are not overly affected by this idea of trying to provoke a weakening f6. Still, the basic position is going to be quite similar, that white wants to put an eye on c5, or go e4 and open up the center in that way, depending also on what black does. So for that reason, Mamedyarov plays what I think is the best move here of knight to h5, just kicking away the bishop, and, well, if the bishop retreats to, say, c1, you've got e5, arguably in a better version than what we saw before. So white plays bishop e3, trying to hold back c5, but Mamedyarov plays it anyway, because he knows not to just assume, oh, he stopped my move so I can't play it. Maybe you can actually play it, because after d takes c5, black has an annoying fork of d4, and even though white can take the rook on a8, it actually turns out that he is losing material, because if you play bishop takes a8, and then you try to take that pawn with bishop takes d4, unfortunately for white, just rook d8 is very good, and white's not really in a position to save the bishop. If you try to defend it with e3, black can just play either e5 or first bishop h3, threatening a checkmate on g2. And then after f3 to block the mate, e5 is going to win the bishop on the next turn, and black's bishops are just way better than the rook and pawns when black has such a strong initiative with all his very active pieces. So Mamedyarov realized that that's a poisoned pawn on c5, and so instead he plays a move knight takes d5 here. The computer comes up with some weird ideas, like it gives moves such as bishop g5 or h3, neither of which are moves that are exactly very obvious if you don't have the engine running, but I guess it has some tactical ideas, like h3 is threatening g4 to kick back the knight. That has some tactical merit, I suppose. But Mamedyarov move of knight d5 is arguably the more natural one, just taking the pawn and asking black what he'll do in response. The game continued e6, again you want to kick that knight away, so that after knight f4 that black is able to get that pawn back, and he decides to do it directly with c takes d4. He decides not to play knight takes f4, I guess, because he wants to be able to have that tempo on the bishop to try to fight for the initiative in that way. Of course, knight takes f4 first is not bad either, but of course this move is also fine. And after g takes h5, or rather knight takes h5, g takes h5, well, white's side, or rather black's idea is that if white takes with bishop takes a8, well, I think you guys remember the key move from before, right? That bishop d4 is running in a rook d8 and you win a piece with the pin, kind of like we saw beforehand. And if you do retreat the bishop, just bishop h3, and black does win back the exchange. And that rising position is going to be about equal, but only because black has this resource of playing d3 and kind of activating his bishop and weakening the white king. Otherwise, the double pawns might give white some hope for an advantage, but here it is really just balanced. This kind of explains why Mamedyarov kept the tension with bishop d2. And in this case, black played rook c8, just simply defending the rook. White played bishop b4, and I don't necessarily agree with some of white's next moves here, admittedly. Even though white did win the game, I don't think it was entirely because of his next move. To me, a normal move would just be to play rook c1, just fight for that open file. Maybe think about a move like queen b3 or queen a4 to hit the pawn. Maybe e4 to kick that bishop and get a bit of space in the center. Given that black does have a central majority, it would be kind of nice if we could, get some space of our own on that side of the board. But white played bishop b4, and after rook e8 and now rook c1, well, Mamedyarov played a very good move at this point. Realizing that you don't really want to rush to take on c1 because it helps the white queen control the file, he instead played queen b6, so that if white takes and it's black who gets to control the open file, and would be able to think about taking on c2. This is the reason why neither side particularly wants to exchange at this moment. White chose to keep the tension with the move queen a4. Black played the move pawn to d3. Again, a great move to get both of those bishops really active here. After e takes d3. I mean, the double pawns are not really felt at this point, because white's not really in a position to attack them, and black does have the more active pieces to compensate. So at this point, you would probably think, okay, after bishop b5, and queen b3, that the position is probably more likely to end in a draw than anything else, although admittedly with black having the better side of the draw, because he does have the more active pieces and the typical Grunfeld pressure against b2. But here is where black started to go a little bit astray. Black played the move bishop to d4, trying to attack this pawn, and I think this is where things start to go a little bit wrong for black. What do you think black should play instead, out of interest? Let's get your thoughts in the comments to see if you can play better than a top 10 Grandmaster and the Azeri #1 GM. So the answer is that I think bishop e2 is the more precise move at this point. And the idea is that, well, you're opening up ideas like a5 as well as hitting the rook, so you can try to, double up the pawns and take b2, this kind of thing. Well, it's probably going to play rook takes c8 here, just so that he's not babysitting the rook on c1. Now, after rook e1 and bishop g4, I do slightly prefer black's chances here, because black's idea is just that he's going to play some move like a5, force the bishop to move, and then try to take this pawn is one of his plans. And even the pin on the b file itself is just very annoying for white and not so easy to get out of in a convenient way. For example, a move like bishop c3, well, that's already a pawn sack. Okay, technically it's not a pawn sack actually, because after bishop c3, bc3, and a b6, it does turn out that you do have the move rook c1 and you are able to get the piece back, but it's still a worse endgame for white after rook d8 and, well, the point is that you're not really able to play the positionally desirable rook takes c3, because rook d1 and then bishop f1 and bishop h3 is going to be a checkmate on the back rank. So white would have to play instead the move b takes c3, but okay, black can put the rook on d2. Even h4 and undoubling the pawns is not such a terrible idea here. White probably is holding without any real trouble, but black has got a little pressure just because of the fact that white does have this extra pawn island and somehow black's pieces are a little more active in this position. But objectively, it's not too much. Unfortunately, after bishop d1, I think that Shak may have underestimated the following retreat of bishop to e1, which really is a very harmonious move, that we're not just defending the pawn from attack, but we also have a little pin on the on the bishop to the queen here, which does tie black up a little bit. And black's next move was definitely a big mistake. Even here, I think still bishop e2 and training the queens is probably still quite alright for black, in fact. I mean, white's probably still a little bit better, but it's nothing too special, I think. But instead, e5 was played, and that actually turns out to be a decisive mistake. So okay, guys, get your thinking caps on. What would be a move you would play with white to punish the e5 error? Maybe you guys want a hint? Well, my hint for you is that sometimes in chess, the way to punish a mistake is to look for the squares that were left behind by the opponent's move. And that's particularly true of pawn moves as well, where we see that this pawn on e6 was previously defending d5 and f5, and now these squares can no longer be defended by a black pawn. Okay, in theory, they can occupy f5, but that's not the same as protecting the square. So now white punished that with a move that basically is the only good move, but more than good enough. The move is bishop d5. And surprisingly, because of the fact that black's pieces are kind of tied up defending one another, black actually doesn't have a good way to defend this pawn. I've played the move king g7 in the game, which we'll get to in a moment. If they play a move like queen f6 to defend, unfortunately that leaves the bishop on pre, with queen takes b5. If you try to defend with the rook, well, white can still take it anyway, because rook takes f7, there's rook takes c8. So that only really leaves the move king g7 that was played in the game. I will point out also that probably rook c1 is the best move actually, but then white can still play bishop f7 with a check. And I mean, white is a pawn up here, and black doesn't have any real compensation. His pawns are still a bit of a mess, quite frankly. In fact, nearly all of his pawns are isolated, so it makes quite a picture. But instead we had king g7, white took on f7, black played rook to f8. And now we kind of see why it would have probably been better to play the move rook takes c1 beforehand, so you still have that rook on the f-file. At least pinning the bishop to the pawn would be somewhat annoying. But instead we had rook takes c8, and now the bishop is no longer under attack. f2 is no longer under any pressure, so white can now afford to take h5 and is simply up 2 pawns. Now after rook f8 and bishop f3, remarkably enough, even this position is not completely dead for black. Granted, I'm pretty sure white is winning with best play, but I think that the move of rook e8, bishop e8, and so playing the ending 2 pawns down might still give black some tiny chances to save the game with the bishop, even though I'm honestly not that convinced it's going to be enough, but at least it was worth a shot. Instead, Shak played queen a6, kind of, I guess, a desperation move, but after rook c1 he realised that he's just down 2 pawns for nothing, and in fact it's the black king that is much weaker than the white king here. So Mamedyarov decided to resign here. If it was me playing black, I would probably play on a little bit longer, but okay, it is technically a winning position. So a very convincing win for Mamedyarov, and definitely residing that the Armenian chess fans will be very much celebrating, because definitely it's one that would not be, I guess, expected by most people that you would beat a world top 10 player like this when the rating difference is exactly 150 rating points. Mamedyarov being rated 2652, Mamedyarov being 2782 FIDE, and it puts Shak in a must-win situation with white in the next round in order to stay in the FIDE World Cup, which, as you may recall, the top two finishers of the FIDE World Cup, excluding Carlsen, end up qualifying for the FIDE candidates known as the semi-final of the World Chess Championship. Let's get on to another game now that I have this one all saved. Our next game is a game between Yangyi of Uzbekistan against Pavel Pankratov of Russia. Pankratov being a player who recently won the Russian Higher League event, which was a qualifier for him to also get into the Russian Super Final Championship later this year. But in this game, he ends up playing Vakidov, who played a very nice game, and let's see how it went. It's a bit of a long game, so I'll keep this commentary a little bit less depth in detail than the first game. So the game went c4, and well, the move c4 is usually played at a high level by players who want to either avoid the Grunfeld, that is to meet g6 with something like e4, and avoid d5 and transpose into a King's Indian, having avoided the pure Grunfeld with d5. That would happen if you didn't play e4 before move 4. And also, another point is if they want to play Nimzo, like d4, bishop b4, well, you get some extra options like knight f3 and e4 to allow you to avoid the Nimzo. So that's the sort of idea behind white playing 1c4 at the high level of play. Vakidov decides to play the move g3, which is another anti-Grunfeld approach, kind of saying that d5 is going to be less effective when you don't have a target on d4 to go after. So black either has to lose time with the knight, or he kind of allows white to improve his structure with b takes c3. In either case, we have an opening advantage for white. So Pankratov basically, after bishop g7, bishop g2, castles and d4, well, now he has been move ordered into a Fianchetto King's Indian. It's too late to transpose to a Grunfeld because c6, e4 is going to stop black getting in his desired d5 push, which you may recall this is how black dealt with a Fianchetto Grunfeld in the previous game, but white used a tricky move order to avoid this c6, d5. That is considered the best answer theoretically to the Fianchetto variation. Other lines do tend to give white a bit of a small edge, and this game will sort of show why. Because black played the move c5 at this point, and it's certainly a move that if you want to play in a Benoni style, then yeah, the d5, d6 and e6 structures will give you a Fianchetto Benoni. Unfortunately for black, white can do better than this. And the move d takes c5 is, I think, the main reason why you don't really see c5 at a high level against the Fianchetto variation. Because if black goes queen a5, white can just play moves like queen at a4. And if black takes the pawn, yeah, that's all well and nice, but white goes bishop e3, and we see the queen is already making its third move with queen c7. And after something like knight f3, white just gets a very pleasant positional pressure with the active bishops, the space advantage. And it's not really obvious what black has in return for it. Meanwhile, I can even play moves like knight d5 or knight b5 later to continue harassing the black queen and stamping that positional advantage. I guess that's the reason why Pankratov played knight a6. But then after e4, I think that white is just somewhat better here. Because after knight d5, the knight is not so well placed on c5. Admittedly, if you don't take on c5, you're just down a pawn, so that's not really great either. But now e5, and this showed some very good preparation by Vakidov, who definitely showed himself to be very underrated, because he actually knocked out Leonid Dominguez in the previous round, where the match was tied 1-1 in classical, but then Vakidov beat Dominguez 2-0 in rapid, which is pretty impressive when Dominguez is like top 15 in the world. So bishop e3 is hitting the knights. I would have thought that black might try a little bit harder to defend it, maybe play a move like queen a5 and at least keep up the fight for the initiative with d6. Now granted, it probably doesn't equalize either. The engine points out that you can technically go castles and sack the pawn but get a very strong initiative with d takes e5, and knight d5 was kind of a guess, but actually queen d5 is a much better reason, because either you'll pick up the knight or b6 you pick up the rook. Either way, not playable for black. So that's a nice little tactical point that really shows why this is in white's favour, even after black plays the best moves. But the game saw knight to e6. White defended the pawn with f4, so that after d6 and knight to f3, well, it means that black is not able to get his pieces to put more pressure on the pawn. Black would love to play a move like bishop to g4 or put the knight on d7, but because of the knight's position on e6, neither of these ideas are feasible. The game continued bishop d7. I mean, white at this point is actually strategically winning with best play. Knight d5, a nice move to shut the bishop. So let's just see how the game played out organically. So knight 6, c7. Again, maybe d5 might be an improvement, but I don't think it overly changes the play. It would also help white get his knight more active, which would be quite nice to, liberate that bishop from g2 and give it, well, to not block it with the TV on f3, as it were. So white plays queen b3, just keeping the tension, developing, clearing the way for a rook to come to d1. Black decides to release the tension with d takes e5, knight takes e5, and now to avoid something like knight c6 and white just having an unopposed bishop, well, black plays bishop d5. But it turns out that again this position is one where white is just very happy after rook ac1. White has the pair of bishops, the space advantage, and a lead in development. We see it already, it's very hard for black to find a sensible square for the queen, with the e5 knight covering d7. So black is just not able to get the harmony of his pieces. He tried to move knight c8, which is probably the best try here. Rook fe1, knight f6, bishop to f2, rook to e8, and now move a4, just a good technical move, not allowing these black pawns to move so easily. b5 probably is a mistake anyway, because it gives a c6 outpost, but still a4 a good move, just takes squares from black's pieces and to grab more space when black has no counterplay. The fact that the computer wants to play moves like h5 is already a sign that things are going kind of wrong for him. The game instead went queen a5, rook c8, queen d8, pawn to a5, just again fixing that pawn as a target, h5, h3, just not allowing any knight g4, knight d7 was played, rook cc1. Okay, these moves are not perfect, but they sort of got the job done in the end, where now after a6 the b7 pawn is fixed as a backward pawn. It's not so easy to move the knight from d7, because then bishop b6 will be a problem. And that sort of leads us to the move that white played here. Granted, there are a lot of good moves, so I'm not going to make it an official puzzle, but well done if you considered the idea of the move queen to a4. The other idea is to play h4, but I like queen a4 because it sort of forces a decision where if the knight moves away, we have bishop b6 like I said. And if you block with knight b5, then the move queen c4 is a nice one, where we're just not letting black get in an easy rook c8 to challenge for the open c-file, and black sets up completely positionally dominated. If black were to play something like knight e5, which is actually what he did in the game, where I think black said, you know what, my position is so bad, at least I should try to get a pawn for my troubles, so that I have some compensation for this awful position. Unfortunately, it kind of works out worse because of the move that white played here. If you are very serious about improving your chess, this is a good moment to pause to see if you can find the move for white at this point. A little puzzle for you guys. And this move will kind of show why it is that taking the pawn, well, an understandable decision, probably accelerate black's demise, objectively speaking. So the game went d6. Well done if you found this move. The idea is not to play bishop takes b7, because then black would play rook b8 or even sack the exchange and get 2 pawns for the exchange. So that's not 100% clear. But the move e6 is just a hammer blow. We're threatening to take on f7. If you play f takes e6, white goes rook takes e6. And I mean, if you take the rook, white's just going to give a check and just completely murder black on the light squares, as you can see. But if you keep the tension with king h8, well, white can still do the same ideas. Rook takes c8, rook e8, queen f7. This is maybe the move that black might have missed earlier when considering the pawn grab. But now white simply takes the pawn. Already bishop e4 is setting up checkmating threats. And because black doesn't have a rival to that bishop on g2, which is an unopposed light squared bishop, that pretty much ensures that with rook e1, if needed, white has got a decisive attack with all of the pieces playing their part. To avoid this, black played a move king to f8, but it doesn't really help. White played e7, rook e7, rook takes, king takes. So the idea of the pawn sack is to have queen e4, just bring the king out into the open, king f8, queen b7, and black played a move rook d8, but after the move bishop d5, there's just no good way to defend this pawn. Bring the rook to e7 wouldn't have helped, because then you would have had a rook c8, and that would have been a checkmate, for those who are wondering about that. So the only sensible way to defend f7 is basically, or to avoid mate even, is to play king g8. But white just took, and at this point it's just completely game over. The game ended rook e1, knight c7, rook e7, so we're threatening to take the knight and also mate on g7, queen a1, bishop e1, queen b2 and rook takes c7, and okay, white's up a piece for 2 pawns, which is already enough to win, but when you add to that the fact that the black king is basically getting mated in a matter of moves if black doesn't swap queens and enter a lost endgame, well, it tells that the game is pretty much decided. White did go on to win another 14 moves. I don't really consider them relevant for the video, so let's stop the game here and congratulate Vakidov on his great World Cup run, first being Dominguez and now beating Pankratov, meaning Pankratov has to win with the white pieces in the next game in order to stay in the competition and to take the match to the rapid tie breaks. Let's see another game. The next one that I have for you is a game between Velimir Ivich against Matthias Bluebaum. And one thing I noticed is that quite a few of these upsets that we have here actually come from players who already achieved an upset beforehand. Velimir Ivich of Serbia, one of the promising young Serbian grandmasters, he actually beat the 2700 AGM Francisco Vallejo Pons in the round 2 match. I think he beat him 1.5 from what I recall. And he's continued his great run by being the very solid German grandmaster Matthias Bluebaum. I don't remember who is the current top German GM, whether it's Bluebaum or Nisapianu or Donchenko. But yeah, he's obviously right up there, one of the top German players with a rating of 2669. By the way, if you are enjoying this video so far, then do make sure to hit that like button. It really helps me out a lot. And comment below with what your favorite game has been. So let's continue with this game, Ivich against Bluebaum. This game was from a Caro-Kann defense, and Bluebaum decided to play a very trendy line of the Caro-Kann. In the old days, after d takes c4 and knight e4, they would usually play this move bishop f5 in the classical variation. The Karpov variation also was seen in the past. Nowadays it's not so trendy. But the thing is, after bishop f5, the bishop does become a little bit of a target to moves like h4, h6, knight f3 and knight d7. And the latest trend is that at a high level, the engines at a deep level realize that throwing in h5, bishop h7 may not necessarily be in white's best interest, because that pawn can become a target and a weakness in the endgame if it gets that far. So the modern trend now is actually to play bishop d3. And I have to admit that I haven't been able to find a way for black to 100% equalize in these positions, even though it feels like somehow the pawn h4 is not as good as the pawn h5. But there's kind of this point that you're able to sort of castle long, and then play moves like g4, g5 if they castle short. So it means it's much harder for black to play his usual development schemes with the pawn h4 somehow, and sort of get away with it in a sense. So that's the reason why the main trend is starting to shift a little bit towards knight to f6. And this Korchnoi variation with knight f6, e6, it used to have quite a poor reputation in theory because of the fact that black has got these doubled e pawns and white has a very healthy looking pawn majority. But by recapturing toward this, away from the center, kind of like you see in the Berlin Wall, for those of you who know the Berlin Roy Lopez endgame, well, we kind of see that black gets a faster than usual development, as we see in the game, with c3. The idea of c3 is to play bishop d3 without hanging the pawn on d4, by the way. So bishop d6, bishop d3 is a nice diagonal. And you'll notice that white is not rushing to play the move knight f3, because A, rook e8 would come with a check, and B, the bishop g4 pin would give black a very good square for the bishop. So to avoid that, white plays queen to c2, hitting the pawn. And then after rook e8, he plays knight e2, simply blocking the check in the most harmonious way. And now the move h5 is the main line nowadays. It's a move that only started to become known in the last 4 or so years, but the idea of the h-pawn move is that you're basically playing against white's usual kingside attack plan. For example, g6 and h4 just gives white a very easy attack down the h-file, and it's known to be quite promising for white. So with h5, you're kind of taking the sting out of this whole, castle long and pawn storm the king side, because you'll always be able to meet g4 of h4 to kind of keep things blocked in that way. And the other point is that if white does change plan and castle, saying, well, now your h-pawn move looks a bit silly, it turns out the h-pawn move still has some value. And those of you who are familiar with AlphaZero and these modern neural network engines, including Stockfish, well, you'll probably be aware of this modern tendency of these engines, which is now spread to top-level GM play, of moving the rook's pawn in different positions to create imbalances. Because if that pawn gets to h3, let's say I play bishop e3, well, we see that in such a position like this, that the forward pawn is very annoying, because if black is somehow able to get a queen to g2, that's going to be checkmate. And even if the queens come off, the fact that that h-pawn is fixed as a weakness means if black is somehow able to take that pawn, that h3 pawn is only 2 squares away from queening, So we see that this is a long-term weakness that's only started to be fully appreciated by, let's say, the garden variety players in the last few years, thanks to the efforts of AlphaZero and obviously the team behind them, which is now being adopted by the top GMs consistently as well. That explains why Ivich played h3. We had knight to d7. And white played bishop to d2. And the fact that white won the game, I guess, is itself a good advertisement for the way that white played it on a practical level, where he decides not to play bishop e3 and he decides not to play bishop f4. I mean, bishop f4 might seem like a very natural move if this is the first time that you have come across this position, especially when you see tricks like rook e2 and bishop f4 backfiring the queen e4 and queen h7 check, which is a tactic actually I fell into in a blitz game of mine a while back that made me really hate my life for a short period of time. But black doesn't have to fall for the trick. You can just go knight f8, and it turns out the trade of bishops almost helps black in some ways, because then the queen sort of takes the place of the bishop, and the remaining piece just come to very active squares, and it's not that easy for white to really demonstrate any kind of meaningful advantage, because he can't really push his pawns and create a pass pawn the way he would like. So for that reason, bishop d2 is a bit more flexible and kind of keeps the piece on the board. It keeps a bit of fight in the position. White played the move rook 8 e1. Stockfish likes the idea of playing c4, but it's not that clear where the pawn is going from there. It looks nice, but black can play around the pawn. Whereas rook e1, it's not the engine's top choice, but it's a more aggressive approach, where probably black should play the move bishop to c7, which is going to kind of anticipate the way that white plays in the game. It means that now f4, you can meet it with g6, and that gives you the time to keep the position closed with f5, g5, so that white is not able to translate his space on the king side in order to direct attack on black's king, which obviously contrasts a little bit to what happened in the game, where after bishop to e6, which is a very natural looking move, by the way, just to develop the pieces and keep your options open. But sometimes in high level chess, it's not enough just to play the move that looks good. You have to actually calculate to see if there are any concrete moves with the good looking move, and then if there are, to try to find another continuation that might be better. So white played a move f4, and I think it's kind of apparent why the bishop is a little misplaced on e6 all of a sudden, because now f5 is going to come with a tempo on the bishop, meaning black is not going to be able to stabilize the king side with g6 like we saw in the previous note. The best try for black might be to play a move like c5, but after f5 we see that white does have a nice space advantage with the move d5 followed by c4. Black can play moves like b5 and open the position, and he will have his chances, but I would definitely give white some preference, because he's got the space, and you know that h4 pawn is also a bit sidelined away from the other pieces. It's going to be a weakness that will constantly be in black's mind. Instead, after queen to c7, white played the move f5. You could start with c4 as well, but this move order is fine, just c4. And since c5 can be met with d5, and black won't even get the b5 break in this version, it means that black is just considerably worse here. And the attempt to repair it with b6 didn't really do black that many favours in the end. In fact, already when they play b6, a move like c5 is already kind of tempting, just to kind of shut that bishop and to fix the pawn c6 a weakness. Yeah, in theory you are giving some squares to black's pieces like the e5 for the bishop, d5 for a piece. But A, it's very hard to get a piece to d5. And B, the bishop e5 can sort of be played around. You can play like b4, knight goes to f3, and it's not that easy for black to really get any counterplay in this structure. A move like rook d1 and just meeting c5 with d5 obviously should be fine as well. And a move b4 as white played a game, it also keeps a big advantage, which is sort of lending some support to the c5 break, as it were. Blue bound played c5 here. White decided to take with the d pawn. An interesting decision. I think taking with the b pawn is a little more natural to my mind, but this line also gives white some advantage. This is a little bit of a long game. We do have a 45 move game here, so let's fast forward a little bit. Probably a6 and trying to open the queen side might have given black the best chances to hold. After knight h7, I think that now white starts to really stamp his authority with knight to c3. Apparently bringing the bishop to d5 was even better, but this is still good. We had knight g5. Again, probably you want to try and trade pieces when you have less space is the general principle. Because now after knight d5, black's not really in time to take on e1. He played bishop h2, I guess trying to clear a square for the queen with queen to d6. But now we see a very nice strategic move by white. And actually, I want to see if you're able to find this move yourself. It's white to play, so what would be your suggestion if you were playing in white shoes? Okay, there's a little pause there to give you time to think about it or to reach for the pause button on your video. Well done if you realize that the key move here is rook to d1. If you want to play bishop a5 and try to put a piece on c7, that is winning as well. I like rook d1 though because it shows a very important principle that when it comes to the fight for the open file, sometimes it's actually quite alright to vacate the open file with your rook as long as they don't have any easy entry points. And we see here with this little traffic light that basically all of the entry points are covered here by the white bishops. And also with black having not much space because of these pawns, it makes sense to keep the pieces on the board so that black remains very congested. The game went bishop e5, and white switched to attack mode with bishop g5. Takes now a really great move of f6. If you gave black time to play a move like f6 and stabilize the position, then black would be doing quite fine with his strong bishop on e5, which bear in mind is an unopposed bishop here. But now everything just comes together. I mean, if you play g takes f6, you're losing to knight takes f6, and bishop takes f6 runs into bishop h7, and white would win the queen there. So, for that reason, black played bishop to d4, white played bishop to h7, and after king to h8, okay, white missed a very beautiful winning move where the engine will tell you that the move of bishop to g6 is giving white a decisive attack. A very nice idea, but the move played in the game is also winning. Yangyi played ref takes g7, king takes g7, and now he played the move of knight to f6, which actually I think might have led black back into the game. I think that a more effective approach is to be more strategic and just trade off black's bishop pair, which is the one good thing about his position. After bishop f5, black has no real way to avoid the trade of bishops, and if black were to take, this is just a strategically winning position because the bishop can kind of be played around on the light squares. Meanwhile, white can just keep hitting that weakness of the king. For example, f6 and queen g4, you've already got ideas like even playing knight f4 and just crashing through on f6 by nook or by crook, as I draw the arrows just to show it to you. So that was the way to win. In the game, white played knight f6, and yeah, basically after rook e5, it's suddenly not so clearly winning. White is still better though, and he did go on to win after some further adventures, after bishop e4, rook h8, and bishop d5. Well, at this point, if black actually had an opportunity to probably save himself here, it doesn't completely eliminate white's advantage, but it would mean the worst would be over if black found the move of bishop f5, which basically has the idea of getting rid of the annoying knight. So rook takes, and after queen takes f5, and let's say queen takes f6. Actually, it's an interesting question which way to take back, but I think I would take with the queen. Black does have the more exposed king, so I think that trading the queens is in black's best interest. And I feel like black probably is going to have enough counterplay himself on the dark squares to probably hold this position. White still got some pressure, but I think that the worst is definitely over for black. Instead, black played bishop to e6. White played a move knight to g4, which actually is not so clear. I think that a move like queen c1 and trying to hit this pawn might have been a more effective approach to the position, maybe setting up some knight e4 forks as well. I think that would keep a very nice advantage for white, because you will have the option to take on e6 later and try to revert back to that good knight versus bad bishop position I showed you before. Instead, we had knight g4, and now black played rook d5, and I guess that Arvich played this because he realized he was winning the exchange, but it turns out that black actually does have an opportunity to get full compensation, which he did not see in the game, or at least he did not play. Instead, black played a move bishop d7, and white played a move queen c1, and basically was just up in exchange for nothing. And white did go on to win in a quite stylish way, but before I get to that, I want to show you the what black should have done instead. If you want, you can pause the video if you want to try and solve it for black and see if you can play better than a 2669 rated GM. Well done if you came up with bishop takes g4. The idea is that we're just simply going to play h3 and open up the white king. The only way to avoid the loss with the attack on h2 is to block with g3. But then black can play rook e8, and even though white is still a lot better, it's not completely clear-cut. Actually, to be fair, probably white does have the move queen f5, which I think I underestimated earlier. And after f6 and say rook d3, white is up a full exchange here. So even though his king is very exposed, white is still better. But I think that with moves like rook e2 and bishop e5, that black would have decent chances to survive this if he continues to play precisely. But in the game, black was not up to the task. After bishop d7 and To me, it's a very mysterious move, because I feel like your only chance is to weaken the white king. The bishops by themselves aren't going to do much when white has the initiative. And after queen c1 and rook h5, white found a very nice move to finish off the game and basically transform his advantage. This is a good moment to pause the video if you want to try and find it for yourself. Otherwise, I'll just show you the answer. So well done if you came up with rook takes d4. Not the only winning move, moves like queen a3 also work. But rook d4 is very clinical because you have the move knight f6, and now either you take the rook or the rook moves away as it happened in the game and you pick up a pawn. Turns out knight d7 first might be even better, but this is fine too. Rook g6, knight h5, making sure that our knight stays alive. King f8 was played. White played queen takes h4. And since black is down 2 pawns and at risk of losing a third, black decided to play bishop takes b5. It's worth pointing out, by the way, that queen takes d5 wouldn't work because, well, I was going to say knight to f4, but okay, move queen d8 is even better, and it would actually just win the queen because of the pin here. So after bishop to b5, we have rook to b1. That was good enough in the game. And after bishop c4, rook c1, bishop a6. I mean, white is just up a lot of material after queen takes d4. He's up 2 pawns, and the black king is very weak to the attack by the queen and the knight. The game ended bishop b7, queen to h8, rook g8, queen to b2. Again, keeping in mind that black cannot take that pawn with the bishop, because then rook c8, and yeah, that's bad news for black with the skewer. After rook takes g2, white just played king takes g2, making sure to avoid that pin with queen g2, bishop d5. And after bishop d5 and king f1, well, after queen a6, queen e2, the checks very quickly come to an end for black, and for this reason, blue baum resigned in this position. So there you are, a pretty nice win by Ivich. Even though he had one little stumble, he still managed to win pretty well and outplay his opponent. So well done to him. And again, blue baum has to win with white in the next game to survive and get to the tiebreak. Let's move on to another game, and this one is one we're actually going to see Amin Tabatabai, one of the most promising Iranian grandmasters, win against 2700 plus GMU Yangyi from China. And Yu Yangyi used to be rated nearly 2750, but he's dropped down a little bit and is now rated 2705. Well, let's see how this game played out. The game started e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, d3. So this is the main line of the Italian, where black plays bishop c5, and white responds by playing the modern Italian with d3, getting a more flexible pawn structure rather than the more hand-to-hand combat of d4 or to move forward knight g5, which leads to far more direct play by comparison. So after bishop c5, white played the move c3, black played the move d6 here, and now white decided not to play the usual plan of castles, and let's say h3, rook e1, and this kind of pseudo-Lopez setup. It is true there is also a modern trend where Sanzai will play moves like a4 in response to a6, trying to grab more space on the queen side, to which in many cases you'll see black play moves like h6 and sometimes pushes a pawn himself in order to take some of the sting out of a4, b4 ideas and prepare bishop e6 to trade off white's strong bishop. That's a main line that's in pretty good standing for black currently, but let's see how the game played out, where white played the move bishop g5, I guess in the hope of surprising his opponent. After h6 and bishop h4, well, the general principle with these bishop h4 pins, which admittedly maybe doesn't hold up so much to modern computer analysis, but back in the old days before engines were super strong, the philosophy was that it was better to wait until they've castled before playing bishop g5, so that if they were to play a move like g5, well, if the king is on g8, obviously it weakens the king a little bit. And to be fair, this would be a very decent approach for black still, after something like a6, castles, and bishop to a7, for instance. I mean, again, black does benefit a little bit from the fact that he hasn't castled short, so he could use that tempi maybe to get an attack on the king's side with moves like knight h5, knight f4. Probably a bishop g4 pin is also going to be likely to follow. Even here, it seems like quite a good continuation. I think that as long as black just maneuvers the pieces toward the king's side, it's not going to go too far wrong for him, is my feeling. But instead, black plays a6 first, and that's perfectly fine too. White decides to play a4, which is an approach you see in a lot of different lines, just not letting black to play b5, but also creating ideas of grabbing space yourself and creating a retreat for the bishop in case the bishop were to become be harassed later. The game went queen e7, and yeah, this is a little bit of an unusual move order, but I don't think there's anything terribly wrong with it, even though I would think that g5, bishop a7 is probably the more natural move order at this stage to try to get value out of not castling short. The game saw queen e7, white castled, bishop a7, and white played the move knight bd2, kind of egging black on to play this g5 and to sort of shoot his shot, as it were. If black does play g5, it's an interesting question how black should follow up the attack. I think that it would be very interesting here to play either a move like knight d7, which has the idea of trying to clear that f6 square for the queen, maybe bring the knight towards the center to control these dark squares and hold back counterplay on the center. Or another approach is to play a move like h5, just threatening to win the bishop with h4, and then if h4, g4 to basically fix this structure on the king side. Though fixing it might actually be in white's favor here. You could play some moves such as maybe knight e1, and black doesn't really have an easy pawn break, whereas I think that white will be able to advance on the flanks at different moments, maybe even just keeps the position on the king side as is, and just continues to advance his queenside play and exploit some of the weak squares left behind by black's slightly reckless pawn charge. So probably knight d7 is the move you should play if you want to equalize as black, but that's something for, I guess, fellow theoreticians to go into more deeply. Instead, black played the move castle short. And I think that this does give white a little bit of a pull if he plays the move b4. He decided to play rook e1 first, which should also be perfectly fine. Bishop e6, b4. The problem for black is that with this pin, black doesn't really have a good pawn break anymore. Typically in these positions, if you have the queen on d8 and the bishop on c1, black would just go d5, get the space advantage in the center, and have a completely fine position. But because of the pin on the bishop to the knight, this is not really feasible. And if you play a move like g5, well, that's now weakening the king. And, you don't really have bishop g4, because that takes a second tempo. Knight h5 isn't so great, because you have to watch out for knight takes e5 tactics all the time, discovering an attack on the knight. So either way, it's not really that great for black here. So he played a move bishop c4, and Yangyi is a very solid player, so he tried to solve his problems in a more patient way, just maneuvering and trying to put his pieces on the better squares for the structure. I don't think that is the best approach, but still after b5, white did manage to show some small advantage, where he decided to play the move rook to b1. The computer mentions bishop f6 as an alternative just to kind of get the queen out of position, I guess, and anticipate knight g6. But I think for a human perspective, rook b1 is probably the more natural move, so that at some point you can either take on a6 and try to use the b file, or even play a move like b6 and kind of, split up the black pawn structure and make that b7 pawn a bit of a target by opening up the b file. Okay, I drew a lot of arrows, but I think this shows the picture quite well. Black played a move knight d7, trying to avoid b6. There's nothing terribly wrong with this move, but I think that maybe, well, the computer wants to play g5, but I can sort of understand why Yangyi didn't want to play this move, because it is a very weakening move in this position. So it's one where you can't really sort of turn back the clock after such a move. And if you play knight g6, I guess white's just going to take and make the argument that after g3, or even b6 might be even better than g3. My idea of g3 is to kind of kill this knight, but b6 sort of kills the bishop, which is even better. And definitely this sort of position after, takes and takes is one where white definitely has some pull. This pawn is a backward pawn that's fixed in place for attacking. And even the d6 pawn could also become a bit of a target later, being a backward pawn. So that's definitely quite unpleasant for black. After knight d7, white decides again to change tack in a way that I think was quite admirable. He realized that if you give black time for knight g6, that the bishop might actually be quite misplaced on a square like g3 hitting this brick wall. So for this reason, Tabatabai decided to transform the position and take on e7, bishop takes, queen e7. Now with the idea of playing the move d4, which obviously if you played it the move before, queen takes c4 to win the knight. But now after queen e6, white is in time to play queen d3. And just keep this nice space advantage, this pressure against the center. And also we see here that because of the bishop being on a7, it's hitting the pawn on a d4. Because when that pawn was still on d3, that bishop was very active on a7 and could really support some very nice active counterplay on the king side. But now that's not really going to happen anymore. So black kind of has to change tack, and as far as what he should do, it's not so easy to say, because if you take on b5, white can play rook takes b5 and try to get some pressure against the b7 pawn. Granted, after a move like rook fb8, black's probably only slightly worse, but you can play moves like a5 and try to fix the b6-7 pawn in place. So definitely black is still under some pressure here, given he doesn't have an easy way to release the tension in the center without making some real concession. I guess another approach is maybe to play, I don't know, a move like rook fe8. But again, white can still play, for example, moves like b takes a6 and, well, make the argument the a6 pawn is a bit of a target. Even a move like knight d cd2 kind of would show that up. And, well, that pawn could be a little bit of a sore point for black. Or, of course, white can go a5 and just play for b6 like we saw in the previous note. So the game saw knight b6, and yeah, I'm not sure I agree with knight b6. I feel like that Yangyi might have miscalculated something here, because white found a really great way to deal with the tension between the knights. I want to see if you can find it as well. What would you play as white here? Because it's this strategic decision that really, I think, shapes the contours for white's success for the rest of the game. Okay, great job if you came up with the move knight to e3. The idea of knight e3 is not just to sideline the knight and have the idea of being able to bring your knight to the center later. It is true that when you keep the minor piece on the board, that's a very nice thing to do when you have a space advantage, so that black's piece remain cramped. But a no less important point is that after knight takes a4, the black is not actually winning the pawn here, because we can simply play the move rook to a1. You don't want to play queen takes a6, because bishop d4 would then discover an attack on the queen. So what we do instead is we take with the rook, and we see that the bishop is under a very unpleasant pin, which is only going to increase in strength with rook a1. And that bad bishop is basically the main reason why black is in a very bad way here, because it will force black to really tie up his pieces to defense. To avoid this, Yangyi played a5, trying to fix a4 as a target. White played a move knight to d2, realizing that still knight a4 is not really that much of a threat, was his logic, which actually might be a little bit flawed here. I think that maybe just defending the pawn with rook a1 might have been better in retrospect. Because after knight d2, I think that you could ask the question, okay, is it really bad to take on a4 after all? And I'm not sure that it is, because after knight a4, rook a1, black has this idea of playing knight takes c3, with the idea of meaning queen takes c3 with ed4 and getting the piece back. However, I think that the move d5 is going to work out for white. Because after queen d7, we can take that knight. And after bishop d4, queen c4 takes and takes. I think that this position is just much better for white because, well, the knights are going to be a lot better than the rook and two pawns in such a close position. Black doesn't really have a way to open up when white has such good control. And either this a pawn is going to fall at some point, or if black goes b6, that c7 pawn is a weakness, and black is just never really going to be able to open up the queen side. So basically, strategically, this ends up being winning for white. It'll take a lot of time, but you'll eventually make a break on the king side and open things up in your favor that way. Like f4, g4, g5, or whatever. So black played rook fd8 instead, which is probably the better decision. White played knight to f5, trying to take advantage of the fact that g6 will hang the h6 pawn. But again, this is a point where it's important to look beyond our assumptions. Failure to do so can cost us the game against strong opposition, or mean that we don't actually win. If black had put his assumptions at the door, he might have realized that you actually can play g6. Because if you take h6, it turns out that after king g7, that the knight is actually trapped on h6 here. And the only way to save it is to play the move d5 to lure the queen away, try and go for some queen d7, knight f5, and get an attack on the king that way. But black doesn't have to allow this. He can just play queen e7, and after knight g4 and knight a4, it's actually black who is going to be better here, because the knight will have a beautiful outpost on c5. Black will have an outside pass pawn, and the bishop has come to life. Not to mention that black now has the open h file as a source for play, along with the f5 break in the middle game, as we kind of know for these different King's Indian and Spanish structures. Of course, in this case, white shouldn't play knight takes h6. A move like knight e3 or even queen g3 would be better. But still, black has managed to gain 2 tempi, which is definitely some achievement. And maybe one reason why instead of knight f5, white might have considered rook a1 and just keeping that pawn safe to keep control. Maybe black's not threatening to take a4 yet, but it's always going to be an idea, so why not just take it off the table right away. After knight f5, black played h5, and that ends up being a pretty big mistake, I think. I'm a little bit surprised that white didn't play rook e3 and try to attack in this way. It would be a nice rook lift. White decided to do it a bit differently with queen g3, and I mean, I guess one difference here is that black can go queen f6, and I think that with moves like knight a4 or even rook e8 and opening up the center. I feel like it's not that easy for white to continue the attack successfully. If you play rook e3, for example, black can always play king h8, and I mean, it's not great, but I mean, the ending is not exactly losing for black either after queen g6. Black does have a few tricks up his sleeve in return. But after g6, now everything starts to work out for white. It turns out the combination of these pawn moves is just a bit too weakening in the long term, and Tabatabai exploited it in great fashion, finding this move of rook e3, which is really a very important move, because you really want to get that rook in the attack and have that pressure against the f7 pawn. And when you give Tabatabai initiative, there's not much that can really stop him. He's just a very strong player with the initiative, as I know from our own personal experience. Black played a move king f8, trying to threaten this g takes f5, but white found a really great move here. Again, it's actually the only winning move, so if you want to try and find it for yourself, this is a good moment to pause the video and have a think about the position and make your decision. Also a good option if you get a drink of water while you're reaching for the pause button or the skip button. Well done if you came up with the following move of queen to g5. If you play knight h6, I think it's going to go king back and it'll just be a repetition of moves, so it doesn't spoil anything, but queen g5 is the only winning move. If black doesn't take, white's just going to invade with the queen, and that's just going to be so bad for black after that. So black more or less has to take the knight, and it's a real lovely finish. After queen a2, white played the move of rook beat e1, making sure that every single piece is coming into the attack. It turns out that playing f6 and crashing through on the e-file is also winning for white, but this is certainly good enough too. Black played the move knight d5, realizing that if you do play queen takes d2, the white will play the move queen to h6 and, well, king g8, rook g3 is going to be mate, but if you go king e7, white will take, and even though on material black is not doing all that terribly here, the reality is that white's got way better coordination. The black king is completely in the open. We're going to pick up a third pawn as well for the queen, for the knight, bishop and rook. So that all adds up to white just being clearly winning here. So Yangyi's knight d5 is a better defense, but after rook to h3, white is basically keeping full control. White is preparing to checkmate with rook h5 and rook h8, which does sort of tie up black's hands a little bit here. So after king e8, white now played the move of f6. I would have probably opened up this file first. I think it would have been a little bit more precise to take, just so you can sort of play rook takes e5 or queen e5 or queen g8 with a tempo. It just gives you a lot more attacking ideas if you open up the position first. But white played f6 and black played a move c6, and like the difference is now that after d takes e5, black has the extra option of running away with the king, which he wouldn't have had if we'd played d5 first. To be fair, it's probably still winning for white, but yeah, it's not as simple as before. Well, I played a move c4 here, which actually might have had the potential to slightly endanger the win, because it does give black an option to bail out a little bit with bishop takes d4, and then after c takes d5. I mean, yeah, white is still probably much better here anyway. You can play knight f3, trade off the bishop. I mean, black's king is still much more exposed than white's, which does outweigh the pass black's extra pawn. So it's probably still winning for white anyway, but it would have given black a little more hope, I think, than what happened in the game. Because in the game, black played knight f6, and his idea is to try to deflect the white queen away and still be a piece up. Unfortunately, this asks a little bit too much of the position. It turns out they're going to computer to move rook f3, with the idea of meeting knight g4 with queen h5 and just basically crashing on f7. This would have probably forced resignation from black. Instead, a move d5 was played, and okay, it's also completely winning in all honesty. Knight g4, you have moves like ed6 with a check that are just bad news for black. So black played d5, we had rook takes c5, and now all the pieces just come in the attack with tempo, so rook d3. And black played king to c7, because if you play king c8 instead, white is just going to take on d8. And we see that queen f6 comes with check, and is even going to be checkmate once the rook and queen are coordinating together. So black plays king c7, at least keeping the rooks connected. And now a winning move for white is rook to e7, and actually it ends up being a forced mate, technically speaking. King c8, you're running into queen f5, and that's just really bad for black. Keep in mind, if they ever try a check, you always got the knight to block. If they go knight d7, as happened in the game, well, white played queen to e5, and after king c8, and now to move rook e takes d7. I mean, this is just completely busted for black, because if you play rook takes d7, the point is that we have queen e8, and we're going to win the rook next turn and basically force checkmate. Just to show you the moves, king c7 takes, and now the mate in 2 is just c5, king takes, and then we have queen d4 checkmate would be the finale. Instead, the game went bishop b6, white played rook takes d8, bishop takes d8, and now after the great move b6, black resigned here, because after b6, white is simply threatening to play queen takes to f5, king b8, and rook takes d8 checkmate. Obviously, it's important we didn't give black the c7 square for the king. And if black takes, then we just checkmate with queen e8 and rook d7 is the mate from there. So there you have it. That's how Tabatabai beat Yu Yangyi. Definitely a very nice game. And a very convincing attacking win by Tabatabai. It shows kind of the right spirit in which to play against a high-rate player. That is to play fearlessly and to show them, well, your very best stuff and show absolutely no fear in going ahead with your attack and taking every opportunity that's given to you. Easier said than done, but definitely this game gives us a lot of inspiration on how to do it. And if you want some more inspiration, do make sure to subscribe to my channel for more of my videos. So let's see what other games we have. There were 2 other upset games as well, actually, that were played as well. But I think that, with this video, okay, it's already been an hour long, so I think this is a good moment to conclude and to say, thank you so much for getting to the end of the video. Congratulations on playing full out as a student of the Royal Game of Chess. Really excited to hear your comments as well about, what you loved in this video, any sort of moves or any ideas. I do try to get back to every one of you in the comments. So yeah, look forward to your responses, and I'll see you in the next video. Get out of here.